Are you a non-boating co-angler in a fishing tournament? Or maybe you don't own a boat, but you get invited to fish with other people in their boats on a regular basis. Well, we're going to talk about strategies and best practices for being a guest or a co-angler in somebody else's boat. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, Chad LaChance here. Thanks as always for tuning into this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. Of course, brought to us by the fine folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. Visit them at sportsmans.com and have your stuff shipped to the store closest to you. There's more than 140 of them nationwide. Here we are, the second week of May, and I keep getting contacts from guys that are in fishing tournaments. I have a long history of fishing tournaments in the past, although I don't these days, and I was reasonably successful at when I did do it. I fished everything from club level stuff up to a BASS Top 150 tournament back in the day. So I have some experience, did a fair number of tournaments, also coached a lot of tournaments as a high school bass fishing coach, and I've been a fishing guide for a long time, and I've fished with a lot of tournament anglers up to and including some high-end guys the year they won their national championships even, specifically Brent Chapman. I believe that was 2012. He and I fished together, and he won the BASS Angler of the Year the next month. Fished with Matt Reed, been in the boat with Kelly Jordan, Boyd Duckett, Steve Kennedy, a fair number of bass guys. And I've done a couple of walleye tournaments as well, although only at the regional level, nothing big there. Not my strength, walleye tournaments, mostly because those oftentimes involve trolling or bait, neither of which are my things. I don't troll. Very, very little do I troll, let's say, and I basically never throw real, live bait or cut bait of any sort. So it's a rarity for me to do very much for walleyes, but I've done a lot of tournaments over the years, and more importantly, as a fishing guide and a boat owner, and I've owned boats my entire adult life, I've had lots of guests in my boat, and I get questions about it, particularly from the co-angler standpoint, the non-boating co-angler, people that are new in getting into tournament fishing. That send me questions, strategy questions, things like that, and I'm always happy to answer them. After all, I am the Fishful Thinker, and I like to think things through. So first off, let me start with this. If you are not a club guy, so you don't fish in tournaments, and you're trying to advance your fishing skills, whether or not you aspire to be any good at fishing tournaments or not, joining a club can really help you a lot. You'll learn a lot. Even if you just do it for one season, join some local bass club and go as a co-angler, and you will learn a tremendous amount, because if you go as a co-angler, even if you have a boat in the garage, you will learn a lot more. You'll spend a lot of time in other people's boats, and those people will be trying to do everything they can to catch every fish they can, and in a lot of cases they'll be more experienced than you are, more than likely, if you're new at club fishing. And you're going to learn a bunch, and if nothing else, you're going to be exposed to a bunch of ways that other people fish that you might not think about, or that you might not notice, or you'll learn new spots, or you'll learn boat control things that you might not have thought about. And all of those things are valuable over the course of a fishing career. It's easy to say, well, I want to catch more fish, but how do we put a plan together to do that? Well, the plan is get better at controlling your boat, fish with more people, fish more waters, which is another thing. If you're a tournament, if you join a club, then the tournament's on such and such day on such and such lake. It doesn't matter what the conditions are. It doesn't matter what the season is or whatever. It's going to be dictated that this is when you're going to go and do it. And that's a really important thing as far as you learning how to force the conditions. From the standpoint of fishing as a weekender, you go when you can. Maybe you fight the conditions, maybe you don't. The weather's not good, maybe you don't go. But if you've joined a club and you've traveled somewhere to fish, it doesn't matter what the weather's doing, you're probably going to go and you're going to fish for the full 8 hours, and you're going to be on the clock, or however many hours your derby might be. And so it's just a really great way to advance your skills. And but there's some keys to it, and I want to point out that when I started tournament fishing, when I very first started, I already had a boat. And the first year that I joined the club, I fished like 3 tournaments out of my own boat, maybe 4. And I did okay. I actually had a top 3 finish in my second tournament, but I was on my home lake, and so it was a little bit, I don't want to say cheating per se, but a little bit easier than competing against guys on a lake I hadn't been on before. But then I also figured out that I was not as good as I was hoping to be, and I was getting beat by guys who I wouldn't have, I didn't see how or why. So the next year that I joined up to do the club, I decided I was going as a non-boater for the whole season. So I had a 21-foot, 225 horsepower at the time, that was the max, bass boat in the garage. And I left it there and went and fished in everybody else's boats so that I could spend that whole season fishing in other people's boats. And I did as many of those tournaments as I could do that season, and I did it as a non-boater. And the way they worked them back then is you rotated as well. So it was a draw. So you're fishing with a couple different people in the same tournament in a lot of cases. And so what I really quickly figured out is that being in the back of the boat, first of all, isn't necessarily a negative. I had to figure some things out in terms of being more effective there, but it basically confirmed exactly what I thought. If I get in a whole bunch of other people's boats, I'm going to learn a lot of stuff. And to be honest with you, half the guys I fished with, at least half the guys I fished with that year, were doing stuff I would have never thought of, or doing it in a place I wouldn't have thought of on the lake, or were doing stuff that I learned was wrong, which was a critical one I figured out with people is, hey, seeing what they're doing wrong while you're in the boat, critical things like that. So fishing as a co-angler was a very beneficial thing for me that year, and I think it would be for most people out there, to be honest with you. Even if you're a highly skilled, been fishing a long time angler, you're crazy if you think you know it all, for starters, and second of all, somebody's always going to have something else to learn. And even after being a professional for more than 20 years, I still learn from everybody I get in a boat with, even if it's what not to do. But I don't want to focus this whole podcast just on being the back of the boat tournament guy, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. Also, could be that you're a guy who doesn't own a boat, but you get invited to go in other people's boats, or maybe it's even a one-off deal and you're just getting invited for once, and maybe you're hearing this. There's some best practices for getting in the back of people's boats, and I will start with that first, and I'll be brief about this. But if you're going to get in somebody else's boat, if you're not a boat person, let's say you don't own a boat or you've never owned a boat, a couple key things in mind. First of all, boats are going to have limited space, and discussing that with the person ahead of time that's going to be your boater or that's going to host you on their boat just for fun is really important. It's how much room am I going to have to carry my stuff. I'm of the opinion that if you're going to be a co-angler on the back of a boat in a tournament, or you're going to be a guest in somebody else's boat just for fun, that you significantly pare down your tackle to the point that it's only your confidence baits. And I'll come back to that in a minute when it comes to specifically tournament stuff. But when I say your confidence baits, the stuff that you use, and if you're a normal guy like me and every other angler that I really know, you've probably got, let's say you've got 100 pieces of fishing tackle, but you only use maybe 10 of those pieces 90% of the time. Well, that's the 10 pieces you bring. And particularly if we're talking about a tournament situation, that is not the time to be experimenting with anything. So you really want to have your most confidence stuff with you and nothing more. I don't bring, if I'm getting in somebody else's boat, and even to this day, I will go happily get in other people's boats and bring my own tackle. Even to this day, I bring very, very little stuff. I might have 30 of my own rods in my big Ranger boat, but if I'm getting in somebody else's boat, it's probably going to be somewhere between about 4 and 6 rods, because they're not going to have storage below deck, most likely. You're going to have them on the rod ramp next to a seat, and they're going to be out, which means they're going to potentially be in your way on the back of the boat. They're going to tangle. It's going to be a chance of getting holes in seats and things from all the lures and whatever. So I pare down the tackle a whole bunch, both the rods and reels and the associated baits. And for the record, the more you pare the baits down, the easier it is to pare down the rods, because if you're an avid fan of Fishful Thinker, you know we advocate you choose the lure first, then the line, then the rod, then the reel. So if you've chosen all your lures that you're going to bring, it's pretty easy to go through and pick your rods out that will fit those lures. So anything that requires specialty, I strongly leave at home. Another thing I would want to know is, am I going to have any dry storage? Because in some people's boats I've got in, yeah, there's a whole compartment open for you in the back for dry storage, which can be really handy for things like your phone, your clothes, extra clothes, all that stuff. If they don't have dry storage available to you, and again, in a lot of cases they won't, then I would strongly recommend you get a small dry bag and carry your stuff in that. They're not typically expensive, but then no matter what happens that day in the boat, you're going to have dry clothes to put on, and that's going to be a lifesaver in the event that it's cold out or anything like that. And I've had several scenarios where co-anglers got in my boat and then couldn't handle the weather, and that is because they were not dressed for it, or they didn't have enough clothes because they didn't have the experience for it, or whatever. Or they got wet. So very important that you understand whether or not you're gonna have dry storage or not, and then do something about it if you're not, because there is nothing worse than having wet clothes in a boat. Same kind of thing goes with food. Ask if they're going to have, if you're a guy that wants cold food in your boat, something that needs to be on ice, find out if they're gonna have a cooler with ice that you can put a couple of items in. Or if not, ask if you can bring a small, like 6-pack size cooler with your stuff in it. But again, communicating with the boater ahead of time is very important. And if you're doing it in a tournament situation, even more important. That can be a key thing. Another thing is, consider silly things like non-marking shoes depending on the boat. Make sure that your shoes are boat appropriate. That can be something that doesn't sound like a big deal until you own the boat. And then I'm going to say real quick, if you don't own a boat, let me throw out 2 things. If you're getting in a guy's boat, don't step in his seats and don't put your feet on the fiberglass. Those are 2 things that no boater ever likes. And you don't step in your car seats. You don't walk on your couch. Why would you step in somebody's boat seats? Yet I see it commonly. Even on guide trips, people step down into my seats. And I have taken to telling people for years now, stay off the seats with your feet. But I see a lot of people do that. So if you're not a boat person, understand that is not appropriate. And keeping your feet off the fiberglass, no matter how clean you think your shoes are, that little tiny bit of sand you picked up at the boat ramp will definitely leave scuffs on his fiberglass. So keep your feet off the fiberglass. Those are just a polite things to do in people's boats. Also, if you're being invited as a guest, offer boat gas money. If they don't take it, that's on them. I almost never take gas money from somebody in a boat, but I always appreciate it when they offer it to me. If you're going as a co-angler, it's probably going to be required by the tournament organization that you kick a certain amount of money to your boater, because he's got a substantial investment involved in the boat. And he's got gas and potentially oil and who knows what else in the boat, maintenance and everything else. And those things cost money. And so from the tournament standpoint, you'll probably be required. But from the friends standpoint, it's good ethics. And then back to the lunch thing or the food thing, if you're going to bring food for yourself, offer to bring it with them. Have that same time when you're having that discussion of, hey, do you have cold storage for food, or do I need to bring some? And can I bring you some food? Goes a long ways towards getting you invited back in the boat again in the future. So those are a couple things that I think are important just about getting in the back of the boat. Now, obviously, if you're physically capable, offer to help hold the boat at the dock. You know, if you're capable of backing a trailer, fantastic. Just offer to help in general, and understand that they may tell you no and stay out of the way. In my case, I rarely want anything more than just hold this rope for a second, because I have such a routine down that if I vary from that routine, I start messing stuff up. So I'll handle all of the fundamentals of launching and recovering the boat. And unless something's going wrong during the day where it's almost an emergency, I'll handle the boat all day on the water as well. So that's really important. So enough with that. That's a little bit of the ethics and just the generalities of getting in somebody else's boat. And now let's change up a little bit to how are we going to make ourselves competitive, or at least be not front-ended, as the term is, over the course of the day. first of all, particularly in bass fishing in a big wide open bass boat, but I've also seen it in walleye boats as well, or even just with your buddy, it may be easier for you to be on the front deck of the boat, but ask that. In the instance of my bass boat, if we're doing something like fishing cover, where we're at close range and fishing cover, like you very commonly see in bass fishing, I would almost prefer that, certainly if it's a friend as opposed to a tournament competitor that I'm fishing against, I would prefer they're on the front deck of my boat with me, because it's much easier to control that than it is to have a guy on the back of the boat that is completely different angles. It's easy for me to control where the front of the boat is all the time. It's a little harder to control where the back of the boat is, depending on wind and current and things like that, since the boat steers from the front. So in that scenario, a lot of times if I'm, say, fishing with camera guy Tim, he's one of my closest friends, if we fished together forever, I'd just as soon he's on the front deck than on the back, because it's just easier for me. Now, if we're fishing open water more, let's say we're throwing crankbaits or jerk baits, it's more open water, maybe we're smallmouth fishing and we're offshore, then being separated is better, because it gives you the angles, different casting angles, and it's a little safer. It's a little tougher to tangle up with your buddy in terms of having a sword fight, or even worse, on the deck of the boat when you guys are both casting up there. So that's a key thing that will be important. And then, of course, if you're a co-angler fishing against the guy in the front of the boat, well, he's going to keep you on the back, I promise, and therefore you're going to need to make some presentation adjustments from there. And I want to point out, before I get too much into the next part of actually catching fish from the back of the boat, the year that I fished out of the back of the boat all season, the whole season I fished almost all the tournaments in the club that year, and I fished them out of the back of the boat. I beat my boater in terms of outweighing them, in terms of the fish, the boater I had in the boat every single day of every single tournament. And that's not to say I won the tournaments, because I didn't. But I won the day against my boater, which is the only comparison that is 100% real, right? Because you're at the mercy of where the boater goes. So it doesn't matter how many fish I know are at the other end of the lake or where I can catch them over there. This boater is going to take me where he wants to take me, and I'm going to have to figure out how to catch his fish. And so from my point of pride, beating them was my goal every day. If I can beat my boater, that's really the best I can hope for. And that was my goal for that year, and I was able to do it. And the reason I was able to do it is by watching exactly what they were doing and using it against them. And that sounds a little easier than it is, but let's get into some of it. First of all, I'm stuck on the back of the boat, right? That's where I'm stuck for the day. Okay, I get it. First thing I'm going to ask is for that boater to turn whatever sonar unit is on the dash of the boat to whatever screen I want it on. And I would not mess with somebody else's sonar stuff. Everybody's particular about that, but I for sure want the screen that I can see from the back deck of the boat. Even if I have to bend down to look at it and all that, I want it turned onto whatever screen is going to help me effectively, whether that be a contour map if you're fishing offshore, or the sonar itself, or whatever the case might be. Whatever screen I feel like is going to help me the most is what I'm going to want. And it maybe you want a split screen where you have the map and the sonar at the same time going, so that you can see where maybe the boat is in relation to whatever waypoint that person's fishing, or to whatever contour line or break line or whatever it might be. You'll have a lot better stuff going on. The guy in the front's going to take it for granted. His screen on the bow of the boats are going to be set however he wants them all the time, and however he left the back screen is where he's going to leave it this time, more than likely too. So ask him to put it where you want it. That's the first thing I would do for sure. Then the next thing, now I have that information available to me. The next thing I'm going to do is watch his casting or their casting angle. What do I mean by that? If we're going down a bank and all of his casts are 45 degrees ahead of the boat, which is about 95% of the time what guys are going to do, particularly at the club level, then I can actually have a pretty significant advantage, because I see where every one of his casts is landing, for one. I will study that, and I will study the angle at which they retrieved it. It's not so much about what he's retrieving, It's a matter of the angle he's thrown, where he threw it to and what the angle is of the retrieve. And so a big thing I did to beat a lot of the guys out of the back of the boat, or that I would do if I want to just beat my buddies out of the back of the boat, is make sure that my angles are opposite of his if at all possible. So if he's throwing 45 degrees ahead of the boat, I'm going to throw 45 degrees behind the boat with a moving bait. And that can be very, very important. If they're concentrating on the inside edge of a piece of cover or weed line or something like that, then I'm going to concentrate on the outside edge of that until the fish prove to me that it's wrong. But what I need to do is study what they're doing first to get an idea of how they're catching fish or what their attempts are, so that I can do something different to get a bite. What I don't want to do is say, dude's catching them really good on this rattling Fritz-side crankbait. Well, I'm not going to go dig around in my box and get that exact same crankbait out, assuming I even had it, or even a different version of that crankbait that rattles and runs the same depth and all that, because that to me is duplicating what he's doing. So the only chance that I would do that was if my angles are 100% different. But typically, if the guy in the front's throwing a rattling bait, I'll throw a silent bait. If they're throwing a silent bait, I'll throw a rattling bait. If they're throwing a white bait, I'll throw a dark colored bait. Something like that, so that the fish are getting a fresh look. I just don't want to be standing 15 feet behind this guy, going down the bank, making the same angled throws he is, because that's the easiest one with the boat moving forward. So that can be very important. And I want to point out that inside-outside edge is a really important thing, particularly around reservoirs with flooded vegetation. Even right now, my home lake, the willow bushes are starting to flood. Well, sometimes the fish are on the deep edge, in other words, the side closest to the lake. But a lot of scenarios, they get behind the willow bush and they're on the side closest to the bank, which is much shallower and potentially more sun-warmed and whatever. So I was fishing a tournament in Arkansas, and ironically, I drew the leader for the last day. And so he had told me we're going to catch him really good, whatever. He pulls me to an offshore bar. And we whacked limits immediately. Like within 10 minutes, we both had limits of fish in the boat. So I'm like, oh, it's going to be a good day. Well, then we're going to go hog hunting. And he took us to a bay, it was on Table Rock Lake. He took us to a bay on Table Rock Lake that had, the lake was high, and the terrestrial vegetation was flooded. There was bushes that were flooded, and he had been catching his kickers to lead the tournament on the outside edge of that stuff. So I watched him. We went down it for a little bit, and I watched him do it, and I'm like, oh, yep, he's throwing, first of all, he's throwing a green pumpkin jig, same thing everybody throws, and he's throwing it right to the outside edges. And I was watching him do it. He was throwing to holes and the outside edges. Well, after about 3 minutes of watching him do that, and there being no variance to where he was pitching that jig, because that's where he had caught his fish, I surmised that it's not going to do me any good to do that right behind him in the boat. And so I put on a dark orange colored, like a kind of a rusty craw colored jig and pig, same basic bait as him, different color. And more importantly, I didn't throw anything to the outside edges. I threw everything between the bushes and the bank on the inside edge, the opposite edge where he was going. And the funny part is, all day long, I straight up pounded him with it. All my fish were bigger than all his fish by the end of the day, and he still won the tournament. I was too far behind to catch up, but I beat him that day, and that's all I really wanted to do. And the important thing to take away from it is, all day long, he kept trying to figure out what I was doing, but he's so focused on the front of the boat that he's not looking back to see what I'm doing. Meanwhile, I had watched him from the back of the boat, figured out what he was doing, and made my own change to be different than that. Even though the fish didn't tell me that, it just gave me a good reason to try it. If they hadn't been on that inside edge, I probably would have fundamentally changed up what I threw to the outside edge. So if he's throwing the jig and pig, maybe I throw the soft stick worm, or maybe I throw a Texas rig, something like that. Incidentally, if I'm going to do that, let's say that it's a pure crankbait bite, right? And or a pure jig bite, whatever. If I am going to throw the same style of bait, besides just color, it will have either a difference in sound, which can be a key one right there, And I think that's a bigger one than most people realize. The silent crankbait, in my opinion, is a very, very good thing for fish that are pressured or in clear water. They don't need all the rattles. It gives them too much clue that it's coming. And fish that already had one rattle bait go by them may not have anything to do with the next one, but I can run a silent bait by there and get their attention. So that can be key. But the other thing I might do is make my bait considerably bigger or smaller than his. And in most cases, it's going to be smaller if I can get away with it, because it's easier to get fish to bite a smaller bait than it is a bigger bait. And that's being heavily proven these days on forward-facing sonar. If you want to be in the hunt in a modern tournament right now, you better have a 3 or 4 inch minnow of some sort on a jig head, and you better be ready to go, and because everybody will bite that. All the rest of the baits out there, maybe somebody will bite, maybe they won't. In certain conditions, they'll really shine. But at the end of the day, if you want to catch them every time, you need a small bait. So for me, fishing in the back of the boat, that's another critical thing. If they're power fishing, maybe finesse fish. Throw a much smaller, more compact, more silent bait. Can be really, really good as well. And then the other one can be scent. And I'm a big, giant believer that fish are, first and foremost, they feel things in their universe, right? They feel the sound and the vibration in the water, both with their otolith bones in their ears as well as their lateral lines down their body. They can hear sound and feel vibration underwater, and those two, of course, are very similarly linked. And then they're visual from there, right? So now they've got to find it with their eyes, and basically any sport fish we're talking about are for sure visual feeders, but they've got to locate the bait first. Then when they get close enough to it, if there is any question about biting it or not, I'm of the belief that a scent, like gulp, is my go-to, but a heavy scent will help get another smaller percentage of fish to upgrade. So it's not going to get you 100% more bites, but it's going to get a percentage of them. And when you're trying to be a tournament guy, every fish counts. Or when you're trying to beat your buddy for fun out of the back of his boat, every fish counts. And if I can get 2 more bites over the course of a good day's fishing, that might be the 2 that matter. And so I will throw a gulp bait, a heavily scented bait of any kind, typically a different scent than what my angler would be throwing in the front as well. So that's another thing that I will do that can help you out a lot. So, and these days, unless we're in a heavy cover tournament, I can tell you right now that I'd be perfectly happy to take almost nothing but a finesse rod and be fine. And if I can have 2 rods, then I would have a very finessey spinning rod with me, and then I would have a light bait caster that I could Texas rig something on, not light powered, but on the light end of the spectrum. So maybe a medium heavy powered casting rod with relatively light line that I could really poke around in the bushes. And a pro's going to have the goat rope and the big stick and the big bait, and that's what he's going to do, but you're going to have a hard time beating him doing that. And so if I've got to fish against him or I want to outfish my buddy, lighter is probably going to be better. If they're fishing a bait that is continuously wound, then I will throw something that is very erratic. So if he's throwing a crankbait, maybe I'll throw a jerk bait. If he's fishing really tight to the bottom, maybe I'll fish 2 feet off the bottom. If he's fishing a straight topwater, maybe I'll fish a wake bait right under the surface. But the key to it is slightly different, but in the same area. Hopefully the boater that you've got has found fish and located enough fish that you're going to be around them. It's just a matter of catching as many or more than they do, and they have the advantage being in the front. So the angles, the size of your bait, the color, the sound, the erraticness or non-erraticness of your bait, all of those things will make a big difference, and I really pay attention to those. So for me, a jerkbait's a classic thing to throw out of the back of the boat, because here's another thing that works really good. Let's say the guy's gonna do a classic front end do. If you've never been a tournament guy, maybe that makes no sense, but he'll get the boat right on the bank and throw straight ahead of the boat, or right on top of whatever channel and throw straight ahead of the boat. Really, that gives you no casting angle at anything. And they'll do that either on purpose or just simply because it's the best way for them to keep their bait in the strike zone the longest. I get that. But one of my favorite tricks is to put a jerkbait out behind the boat, and as the boat's moving, literally keep it right behind the boat and just keep popping the rod tip and throwing slack at it, almost as though you're trolling, but you're not, which is not legal in tournament fishing. Because what happens is the boat goes by and goes right over the top of the fish when they're being fronted, when the guy's right on the bank or right on a grass line or whatever the thing might be. You're going right over the top of the fish. Well, the fish behind it, we all think are spooked and whatever, but that's not necessarily the case to the point of spooked, like not eating. It's just there's changed them a little bit. So something that's erratic, that's coming literally right behind the boat. I mean, almost right behind the boat can be really good. And you can ask Kelly Jordan, pro Kelly Jordan, about that. I drug a 10-inch lizard behind the boat all day long because he had the boat going so fast that I couldn't really do anything, and we were right up against the sawgrass the whole day. It was on Lake Okeechobee, and so I drug a 10-inch lizard behind the boat and just swam it behind the boat everywhere we went. And I had a significant lead on him by halfway through the day, and literally every fish was caught 20 feet straight behind the boat. And the boat had just been there. The water's like 3 feet deep. If you've ever been on Lake Okeechobee, there's not a whole lot of depth there. The water's shallow, but they're used to boats banging around. Boat went over them. Boat keeps going. Well, now here comes lizard, 30 feet later, 40 feet later, and they bite it. So, and the biggest thing there is just that you have to understand that the boat doesn't spook the fish as much as you might think, and especially once it has passed. So it's just a key thing right there. Don't be afraid to work something right behind the boat. And if the water is acceptable, I will do something like a jerkbait that I can make erratic. If not, in a place like Okeechobee, then it's going to be more of something I can swim. And a soft swim bait would be an excellent call in that scenario as well. Something like that. So most important thing, this is the biggest thing. If you learn nothing else from this podcast, learn this. Confidence catches fish, and being in the back of the boat is not automatically a disadvantage. And there's a lot of scenarios where I fish with my buddies where I will purposely put myself in the back of the boat just so I have the difference in angles to work with. So keep those things in mind, guys. Being in the back of the boat is not an issue. If the guy in the front beats you, it's probably from some other reason than the fact he was in the front of the boat. So I could probably go on with this topic for a long time, but in the interest of keeping these things relatively brief so that you guys can hear them, maybe driving or something like that, not take a tremendous amount of time out of your day, I'm going to end this one right here. If you have questions, let me know. Chat@fishfulthinker.com. We'd love to answer those for you. And if you would join our conversation on social media, I'd appreciate that at Fishful Thinker on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, of course. Check us out on World Fishing Network, Altitude Sports and Entertainment, either one of those. We're airing like 5 days a week on those right now. Love that. And especially the YouTube channel, guys. I don't know if you're listening to the podcast there or wherever else you are, but the Fishful Thinker YouTube channel is super important to us. There's like 650 videos up there now, and we add them constantly. So we appreciate you tuning in. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.